But we're more than just a technology company, we also are a delivery company. And the reason for that is we've typically found that when we are asked to deliver the technology, we're also asked to deliver the improvements. So we're also an agency. And our agency focuses on three things really. The first one is operational savings. But the bit of the business that I'm most focused on is the acquisition side and the CRM side, and the integration of both of those into a hotel, and also the automation of both of those. So effectively what we do is we find, create and build direct relationships for hotels where they own the relationship all the way through. And the easiest way of comparing us is with an OTA, where the reality is that it's their relationship, and what they are doing is delivering their customers at a level of bookings for you to consume. So we like to think that we're the OTA you'd really like to work with, because we're building your relationships, not ours. One of the things that we've built is an app, and as part of building that app, we've talked a lot to a lot of guests and also hoteliers with regard to what a good app looks like. And what it comes down to is really four simple things. The first thing is convenience. If it's not convenient for the guest, it's not going to get used. Equally, if it's not convenient for the business, it's not going to get used. But if it is convenient, and by convenient we mean it's got the things in it that a guest will want to use, then it will get engagement. And by engagement, what we mean is typically check-in information, check-out information, bookings. But from my perspective, the key thing is that engagement delivers data, and data is the lifeblood. And off the back of using that data, profit should be one of the things that comes out of this. So if an app has all four of those, then it's potentially going to be useful. If it doesn't have one of those, then you're going to struggle to actually have that app deliver for you. But I want to talk about each of these in a bit more detail as we go through. So the first thing is it should all be about the guest. Fairly obvious. If we have everything that the guest is requiring from us, what they expect to see in an app, then the guest will engage with that app. But what do we mean? So when we have talked to guests about what they expect to see in an app and what they will use, there's lots of stuff that they tell us they're interested in, lots of stuff that they say they're expecting, and there's lots of stuff that we might expect that they don't talk to us about. So the single most important thing that we have seen is guests want to be able to use an app to check in and check out, and that will include also getting into the room and getting out of the room. So our view is if your app only does one thing, this is the one thing that it should do, because this is what guests are looking for. So in order to have check-in and check-out work, you also need to have a digital key, which means that that needs to connect to intelligent locks that more and more of the providers are out there providing. And again, from a guest perspective, invoicing is important because the single most popular, in inverted commas, reason for somebody to have to queue at checkout is because they need that invoice to give to the accounts department. So to have the ability in the app to generate on demand that invoice, we would say at a guest level is mission critical. The other thing is Wi-Fi. So Wi-Fi from a guest perspective is simply, it's available, there's usually a basic system that nobody needs to log into, or there's a basic login. But typically what we see is if there's premium Wi-Fi, there's often a separate system that people need to log into. And our view there is that Wi-Fi login should be simply part of the app. Again, it enables you to generate data, and it's also, if it's well done, and it's instead of having a Wi-Fi portal, you actually have the ability within the app to connect. You've also got, from a marketing perspective, your first opportunity to say, do you want to hear from us? Is there anything you'd like to get in terms of offers and invites? The other things from a guest perspective that we hear are one-to-one rates, offers sometimes points. So where you are an independent brand, where you have lots of different locations and you have particularly business-oriented guests, points-based systems are more likely to be of interest. But one of the things when prompted we find a lot is that preferences, the ability to say I would like to have a room at the back of the hotel or the front of the hotel or a long way from the bar or on the top floor, those kind of things we have found are of extreme value to those who want to engage with the brand, and the app is a very, very convenient way of encouraging them to do so. Those all relate to bookings, and from a guest perspective, I don't think really the guest cares whether the booking is made in the app or whether they're pushed to a website in order to make that booking. But I'm going to talk about where the booking should be made in a bit more detail when we start talking about the business as opposed to the guest. And then the other thing that we found that people want is to be able to communicate requests in room, make purchases from the room rather than call down to concierge. Table reservations, both in-house and using connections out to people like Rest Diary, and location-based offers and opportunities are also a thing that when prompted, people ask for. Beyond that, however, we find that they don't ask for very much. So things like the guest directory, which is available in the room, is something that probably should be in the app, but in terms of its ability to generate data, which we'll talk about in a moment, there's not an enormous amount of data that typically comes from a guest directory, beyond the ability to actually know what people are typically asking for, and therefore what you could proactively let people know beforehand or in different ways. And the other things, just before we go forwards, what we don't find is that people are asking all that much about the requirement of feedback, reviews on TripAdvisor. Typically people will just go. It's not reason to not put it in, but it's not something that we are finding people proactively are saying this is a good app from a usage perspective. Not a reason to not do it, but it's not going to be a game changer if you don't have those. So from a guest perspective, we think these are the things that an app should have in them for a guest to say this is a good app. But from our perspective at Noetic, it's not really about the guest at all, despite the fact we built a guest management system. It's about generating data that enables us to do interesting things with it. The engagement of a guest should be generating data that enables us to do something quite important, which is actually to predict what's going to happen next. And off the back of being able to predict, we can then adjust our marketing and our engagement ourselves with customers to help encourage those things to happen. So let's have a look at the same picture, but in terms of its ability to generate data that we might be able to use. So again, from a data perspective, the single most important thing I would suggest is you should be able to do check-in and check-out, which requires digital key and also requires invoicing. So from a data perspective, what this does is enable us to get primary information. We know when the guest has arrived, we know when the doors are being opened, but the key thing from a digital key perspective is operational savings. So Asa Abloy have a calculator that suggests that an intelligent app attached to one of their locks, which probably means anybody else's as well, will deliver at least £50,000 worth of savings per annum for every 100 locks that you have. Now, I can't quote that number as being that's what we have found to date, but what we have found where we have put our app in with hotels that have intelligent locks is that we are seeing quite rapidly resource reallocation within the hotel, not least on things like if you look at digital key, one of the things that you're able to do with most of the APIs that relate to that is you can use the phone itself to ask the lock the status of the battery. So one of the things that constantly happens to me when I'm in hotels with my plastic key is my plastic key is always and inevitably quite close to my phone. My phone then wipes the key and I have to go back down to reception. That should never happen with digital key, but the equivalent problem is you go to your room, you put your phone up to the door, and the door doesn't open because the battery's dead. And if you have enough digital locks, then that's going to happen. But what you can do, and what an app should do, is ask the door, ask the lock, what's your battery status? And you can do that every single time a phone is put up against the door. And simply by doing that, you can then pulse that information over to housekeeping to say, this is the battery status of this lock. It's getting to the point where it will require changing soon. Go off and do it when the lock is not being used. So at the level of removing friction, simply taking that information and using your app to do so should remove any opportunity for a customer to get locked out of their room. So invoicing is a thing that we think is important, not just for the guest, which I mentioned earlier, but also for the business, because if you don't need to go to the front desk to check out to get your invoice, and your invoice is in your app on demand, then there's no reason to actually go to checkout. You can just leave the building. And again, Wi-Fi, we talked about that in terms of the guest, but again, in terms of the business, what that enables you to do is generate data in terms of who's actually consuming the Wi-Fi, when they're doing so, what kind of things they're doing so, and most importantly, it's a place where you can get permission potentially to communicate with those individuals. So the second thing then relates to bookings. So the reason why you want your guest making bookings within the app, or certainly making bookings however they're making it, is that if you have the information that relates to the behaviour that you see over time from the customer, then pushing private rates through the app to that individual is more likely to get engagement over time. So if they know, for example, that they can get a better rate the next time they stay in the app, that itself is a reason to use the app, as long as they have a requirement to stay again. Therefore, offers and points and preferences are also things that you should be putting into your app, because those are the things that will engage with you. But we think it's important that the booking is made in the app and not on the website. And the reason for that is a booking in the app is private. It's hidden from absolutely everybody. It's a private engagement between you and the individual. Whereas any booking that goes onto a website is visible. It's visible to Google. If Google can see it, then Google's own algorithms can look to see what is going on with regard to your relationship. So a private relationship, which means encouraging everything in the app, is always a good thing, because the data is only available to you. It's not available to anybody else, which means nobody else, people like me, can build models to try and work out what your guests are doing elsewhere and how you might compete with that. The best way of doing so is to hide all the data. And that's the single most important thing that an app can do. Other purchases, well, of course, you want to have that information, and as far as possible, you also want that going on within the app, because cross-sell and upsell opportunities are easy. If you've got the app in the pocket, you're much more likely to be getting that. So whilst it's great for the guest at engagement level, it's also great for the hotel, because what you're able to do is encourage cross-sell and increase the value in stay. But that same data is also available to start looking at those who haven't taken up those offers or opportunities, and you can use that in automated CRM programs to encourage others who look similar to do the same kind of thing. Feedback, whilst I've suggested at a guest level, people don't necessarily see that as an essential, because they'll go to TripAdvisor, people will communicate whenever they want to. I do see this as quite important from a data perspective, but particularly the surveys. So a well-organised survey should get a very high rate of response, but it does need to be well designed. People will give you information, is my experience, as long as you ask the right question in the right way. And we had an example recently with one of our clients where what we found was, I'll be careful how I describe this, one of the questions that we asked related to how clean the room was. And most people were saying the room was very clean. If they didn't say it was very clean, they were saying it was quite clean. Now you could argue that that's actually a very positive set of information. But what we also found was that when we compared that response to how likely are you to come back, the self-reported level of intent to come back again dropped by 3 times. So there's a 2/3 of all of those people who might have come back are now saying, I'm unlikely to come back just because the room was quite clean rather than very clean. Now, because we know the lifetime value of all guests all the time, what we were able to do is do a calculation of the cost of the words quite clean, even though we weren't very able to describe the difference between quite clean and very clean. Because when we looked at all of the text commentaries that we found, there didn't seem to be very much. But the key thing was, by being able to work out the cost to the business of somebody saying quite clean rather than very clean, within a week, additional resource had been made available to try and move those guests who were saying quite clean, or not those guests, but the overall figure for guests over the next few weeks, to move from most people saying very clean to a higher proportion of people saying very clean. I've just mangled that quite badly, but hopefully what you can hear is by reallocating resource to additional housekeeping, the intent was in the automated surveys in the following weeks, what we should see is a higher proportion of all of those guests saying very clean, and therefore the overall rate of unlikely to come back should increase as well. The app is a place where you can simply ask that information. Do you want to tell us about the room? Do you want to tell us about what you like, what you didn't like? And the data there should be used for changing and improving those things that are not as positive as they might be. Local information is also a thing that is just a way of actually generating more engagement with the app. There's very little in terms of data that you're going to get from adding things like connections to weather and events, unless you are also going to be getting commission from pushing those events through. But that's not a reason to not put it in. But it isn't a way of generating an enormous amount of data. I think the key thing for us though is, if the convenience that's within the app generates engagement and the engagement then delivers data, then that data should be intelligently used in an automated way to make better business decisions, whether they're decisions about operational savings or decisions about who should get what kind of offers or what kind of one-to-one rates. Intelligent use of that data should lead to a higher gross profit for the business. So, operational cost savings can come from using the digital locks, not having to have as many people on the reception desk for check-in and check-out. You should be able to use the app to get more permissioned relationships. And one of the key things there is most hotels obviously are getting the majority of their bookings from OTAs, and the majority of those OTAs are hacked email addresses, so you can't practically use them. And the reason they're doing that is because they own the relationship, not you. So the first time you have an opportunity to engage with these individuals is at check-in, where you can get their direct email. But there's an opportunity at check-in to get people to start checking in using the app instead of using the front desk, particularly if there's a queue. If your app simply says, if you know your booking ID and you know your name, then you can check in directly, just go straight to your room. So that's the first opportunity for you to get the real email address, which is actually what you want. And if you are telling people that through point of sale that you have private rates and offers sitting in those sitting in the app ready for them, then a significant number of those people who have come indirectly are likely to engage via the app. So we've talked about cross-sell and upsell. The key thing is also the higher propensity to repeat that you have from guests who choose to use an app. So what we have found is that those who do use apps have a higher propensity to repeat. What I'm not saying is that you can use an app to get people to repeat more. It's a very useful indicator, though, of this is a potentially high value over time customer if they're going to download an app onto their phone. And the key thing is using that data then for better acquisition and better CRM. Now, from a CRM perspective, if you know that you've got a profile that is likely to come back, then the obvious thing to do is not give them a one-to-one rate until you haven't seen them come back, because giving them a one-to-one rate now is potentially value destroying. But giving them a one-to-one offer once they're outside the window of when you're naturally expecting them to come back is a thing that you would want to be doing. And all of this is completely predictable if you, or not completely, but very predictable if you have access to all of the data. And I'm going to talk about that in a moment. But the key thing here is all about driving higher lifetime value, and off the back of higher lifetime value, more gross profit to the business. So what we should want is an app that the guest is going to use all of the time. But that is almost never what actually happens, because what guests do is whatever they want to do. They'll use the website, they'll use the app, they'll use central reservations, they might send an email. So whilst the app should be at the heart of everything, the reality is you can't ignore any of the other channels. And it should fit into a particular space. So this is believe me, this is a simplified view of how everything connects, and if one of our developers were doing it, was illustrating this, it would be much more complicated. But the app is just part of everything if you want to get it to work. So if we think about the app and the booking engine that you'll have on your website, there's one of two things that's going to be happening. The app will either push those who want to make a booking to the booking engine on the website, or it will have in-app bookings. But both of them will either connect directly into the PMS, or the app will connect indirectly, simply because it's the booking engine on the website that's doing all the hard work. But you've probably got a channel manager which is delivering 50, 60, 80% of all your bookings indirectly, which the app isn't touching, and that also connects directly into the PMS. You may have a revenue manager which also connects directly into the PMS. So the question then becomes, where is your central repository of all guest information? And our view is that is absolutely not what you should be using the PMS for. A large number of hotels are using it for that because everything is connecting into the PMS, but it's certainly not how we think things should be set up. So the app and the website, central reservations, front desk, and things like your third-party bookings, our view is that all of those should be grabbed before they go into the PMS. And we create what we call, imaginatively enough, a unified view of all bookings, all guests, all information that relates to them that is not related to the property. So the property management system acts exactly as it should do. It's there to manage the property, whereas our unified view is there to manage and host all of the data that relates to everything that the guest is doing. And the reason why we do that is twofold. Firstly, it means that there's only one connection required between the PMS and everything else, which lightens the load on the PMS. But just as importantly, if not more so, it enables intelligent analytics, which is the ability to take all of the information and build automated models that relate to what is the guest likely to do next, when is the guest likely to do it, how likely they are to do that, what kind of stay are we going to see, and therefore, what should we not do from a CRM perspective? Because if we can predict natural behaviour, then what we don't want to do is be making offers when the guest will take the offer but doesn't need the offer in order to come back. So this is all much easier to do if you've got the data before you pull it into the PMS. Getting data out of the PMS, and we specialise in Oracle, is an interesting process on the whole, and certainly much more difficult than actually keeping all of the information and pushing into the PMS everything that it requires and keeping the rest outside. So off the back of the intelligent analytics and the predictions of what people are going to do, when they're going to do it, and what kind of actions there are, what we talk about at the personalisation stage is effectively the agency delivery. What kind of changes would we want to make on our paid advertising and our display so that we can encourage, at the point of acquisition, bookers and guests who are likely to be higher lifetime value over time? Well, the data is available in the system, not just from the app, but from everything else, to tell us what kind of bookers we're likely to get and which of those bookers later on are likely to engage through the app, where the app is the private relationship, where the app generates data that no one else can see. So from a CRM perspective, what we can do is we can automate the process of pre-stay emails, post-stay emails and surveys, driving those things through into the app. Offers can be sitting in the app that will be switched on and switched off based on what we're expecting to see the guests do over time. Whether or not they use the app or they go onto the website or they respond via email is part of their omni-channel choice. But obviously what we want to do, because the app is the place where everything is hidden from everybody else, is to encourage those bookings through the app. And from a media perspective, as I said, you're very unlikely to get people first time to come through an app, because it's much easier to go to a website and make your first booking than it is to take the extra step of going to an app store or the Android store, downloading an app, then going into the app, registering it, and then trying to make your first booking. That's a much more complex journey, and therefore doesn't happen very often. Much more likely is that the advertising that you are generating is going to push people to the website. But the data behind the adverts that you put in paid display can, using data that suggests over time this profile will migrate to using the app on the second occasion, the third occasion, you can use that to indirectly drive more customers first time who on the second occasion will move through to the app. So the key thing is always taking the data that is available and building in an automated fashion advertising that is going to drive over time high lifetime value bookers as opposed to first time and possibly only time bookings. And I'm just going to highlight meta and availability there because I'm sure I'll get questioned on why I didn't mention two of the circles. But there what we do is we pull availability from the PMS and we have predictive models that instead of asking the property management system what the availability is at any given time, we ask periodically what the availability is between now and the next 330 days. And then we use ourselves predictive models that would say, if we ask the PMS again in 5 minutes time, what do we think the answer is going to be, bearing in mind that we've just seen some apps through, some bookings through the app, through central reservations, through the website. So we don't need to ask the website. Sorry, we don't need to ask the PMS because we already know what the answer is. And we take all of that information and create effectively a very big bucket. And it's that bucket that Google is then interrogating. For our biggest client, it interrogates that bucket 7 times a second, so that it doesn't have to go and talk to the PMS and ask it 7 times a second, which would probably break it a few seconds in. about what the availability is. So that directly doesn't generate data that relates to the app, because all of that is Google Hotel type stuff which pushes people primarily to the website. But once we've got that information, we can then go through the same process of looking to see whether those that we've got through from a Google Hotel ad are likely to come back, what are they likely to come back on, and how can we promote them coming back via the app. And then from a metrics perspective, because I do data, I'm never going to not talk about metrics. From the property management perspective, we're always interested in occupancy, ADR, and RevPAR and its ilk, but only to the extent that actually they are helpful to understand the business from a property and rooms perspective. They're not helpful at all from a app perspective or how people are using the app. So we're also looking at the cost of acquisition, cost per booking, not just the first time, but over the relationship that exists, the repeat booking rate, where that booking each time is being made, because bookings through an app aren't a secret, but they're usually significantly cheaper to service than bookings from elsewhere, and the lifetime value. And all of those things are updated as we see new bookings from every guest. And then gross profit is an output from the efficient delivery of both of those systems. So outputs that relate to the PMS and outputs that relate to the guest are both important for understanding gross profit. And gross profit is the key because that enables businesses to have a choice about decisions that they might make differently. If you're not making profit, you're obviously not in a position to make good choices. So I'm just going to finish with, I said there were 4 things that you needed to be looking at. The reality is that there are 5, but if the app doesn't deliver convenience to the guest, they're not going to engage with it. If they're not engaged, you're not going to get data. If they're not going to get data, then it certainly isn't going to be helpful with regard to the business making more profit. But the key thing is that the app shouldn't be a thing that sits on the side. It should be a thing that is intimately connected with everything else. It's just another channel, but it happens to be a channel that, because it is private, enables you, the more that it's being used, to be hidden from Google and the OTAs. And that's it. That's a whistle-stop tour through what we think an app should be delivering, and are there any questions? Super. Okay. Thank you very much for your time.